Purpose of this item is to present to the management committee an overview of the Florida Wildlife Corridor as enacted and funded by the Florida legislature, its current status, and what is envisioned going forward with regards to conserving lands in the CHNEP area, the connection to the CCMP. This relates to Fish, Wildlife, and Habitat Protection Priority Action 2, which is to encourage and support the permanent conservation of environmentally sensitive lands and critical habitat areas through land acquisition and conservation easements held in perpetuity for habitat resilience and migration. And Jason, we just heard about a potential consideration of wild and scenic river designation through the federal process for two of our rivers regionally, Peace and Mayaca, and there may be some relationship and overlap in some of the goals and objectives with the wildlife corridor. So look forward to hearing about this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate having a chance to come and talk to the group and see how maybe we can work together to get more done than we would have separately. So that's great. The first slide is really a video, so I'm not sure if you just want to go ahead and hit play and it's. The 18 million acre designated Florida Wildlife Corridor is a geography that really is intended to capture a representative portion of the really high priority ecological areas throughout the state and the connections that are currently viable for future protection of a sustainable biodiverse wild Florida. And it's 18 million acres is a very large landscape for decision makers in the public to really get their minds around. So helping people to understand what those priorities are, how they interface with local economies and local decisions, what that means for long-term management, and how to face the urgency of the crush of development that's going on in different parts of the state. It's complicated. So it's a lot of this is about messaging. One of my hopes for the time we have together today is to really to use this to see, explore how the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation might work with you all to do a better job of getting the right messages in front of the right people to make sure that budgets are fully funded and that there's support where there needs to be support, and where we have lack of resources and lack of expertise that we can collectively identify and recognize that that's the case and look together for ways to solve some of those problems. So that's sort of the upshot. But the mission for our organization is to work collaboratively to do these things and to convene and to invite. We don't intend to ever be the experts in the room on all the issues that are important, but we want to help to convene and to message those areas so that we can get some of that conservation done. As the chief conservation officer for the organization, I spent a lot of time looking at that high level, but also recognize that there's a lot of need to drill down. And I'll give you a little bit of my background just in case it's helpful. I'm not a Floridian by birth. I was raised in Iowa, and I came here. The first I was an intern in Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary back in 1990. Fell in love with Corkscrew, continued to come back. Spent a big portion of my conservation career, 17 years at the sanctuary. I have a land management background, wildlife monitoring and hydrologic measuring, to measure success management of the sanctuary. Worked quite a bit with mitigation bank, anti mitigation bank as a part of that. Regionally, worked as a science coordinator for that area for Audubon, looking at growth and development and the impact that were associated with that, and how that impacted the management and the perpetual management of those. Those are some things that might play into conversations of how we might look at and benefit one another. One of the things that jumped out at me and has persisted from the early days at Corkscrew was just the fact that there are things that are second nature to people who manage and steward lands and landscapes, manage budgets for those kinds of activities that aren't clear to decision makers approving those budgets, or to the public that is voting for certain line items. And getting the right messages to understand how stewardship of natural areas is not necessarily a resource or fiscal sink, but appropriate management of those areas actually can redound to the benefit of the greater public and help line items and budgets downstream if we take a look at sort of the whole cost accounting piece of that. So helping people to understand some of those issues is something that maybe we could help with as an organization. The Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation really isn't that old. We're less than a decade old, but in 2012, Carlton Ward, Mallory Dimmitt, and Joe Guthrie took this the goal of demonstrating to the public that there was this connected landscape and that it looked like this mosaic of different land cover types, and wanting to bring to the public's attention sort of waving your arms, hey, the corridor exists, there's this connected landscape, isn't it great? And raise awareness. And eventually that led to a second expedition, which was done in 2015. It was another 1,000 miles that took off and connected the Panhandle portion. And so the very first two expeditions really were the genesis of our organization and the idea of calling this place the Florida Wildlife Corridor. Since then, we've focused a series of smaller expeditions on specific places within the corridor that we felt needed more attention. There were some needs for some solutions. Maybe the graphic's not working. I anticipated it would show where our other expeditions were. We've done one called.
There it goes.
Oh,
It's going.
need to change the timing setting. That slide. But the goal is to give us an opportunity to dig deeper into the landscapes and see what is special about it. How do some of these special focus areas, how does the economy, the local economy, play into the conservation picture? What's possible to close some of these really critical urgent gaps and to help tell that story to the public? And one of the things that we found is not only do we learn a lot about those areas, have a story that we think is worth telling and is interesting, but that the community that's there learns also about us. And we have an opportunity to continue to come back and work on helping with those areas because we've spent time in it, getting to know the local actors who are really critical and key in getting that conservation done. So we've done a series of those. The very last one was in the O area up in Northeast Florida, where we went from the Osceola National Forest to the Ocala National Forest to the Osceola National Forest. Camp Landing is right there in the middle of that, and it was terrific. That film is not yet streamed, at full access. We're still doing some local premieres, but before too long, that film will be available to everybody. And our hope is to do the next one in our plan is to do the next one in Southwest Florida, to go back to that course group program. And you can play this slide.
Is this?
So those two expedition clips come from the short films that accompany those expeditions, and although the first one can be found on the WEDU website, and you can get links from our website as well. But again, the goal here is to tell a story that's meaningful and moves conservation. That's one big part of what we do. But what we found over the course of our existence as an organization is that there's tremendous work being done in some areas, and there are places where work needs to be done. But there's not a group or an effort closing some of the gaps, and so raising attention has continued to be a role we play, but a slightly different role. And with the signing of the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act in 2021, that was a turning point for us, because now there's this recognition, the statewide recognition, unanimous through House and Senate, signed by the governor. Funding came along with that, which was fantastic. So Rural and Family Lands and Florida Forever, along with the Florida Conservation Trust, Florida Community Trust, got some additional funding. We're hoping that can continue. Full funding of those is important and necessary to get the job done. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time with sort of looking at the corridor itself and some of the areas in the corridor that might be solved by those large funding programs, some of the areas that don't. So this map, you can see it on our website. You can download it from our website. You can get the shape files from Tom Hochter's Center for Landscape Conservation program. And the dark green areas encompass 10 million acres of conserved land already in the state. The first piece was purchased in, I think, 1916, which was down in the Everglades now. It's the Royal Palm State Park. It wasn't actually a state park. We didn't have a state park system at the time. But over 100 years of conserving habitat within the corridor. And the light green are opportunity areas. Those are areas, the majority of which are in ranching or timber operations. So they're working landscapes for the most part. And there are 8 million acres that already conserved areas. So that's the playground in which we play, trying to get this corridor connected. And if you take a look at the two largest land acquisition programs, Florida Forever and Rural and Family Lands, those are the orange and the yellow within that opportunity area. So this is these are data from 2022. So it's a little bit old. Since this time, we've had over 180 additional projects apply for rural and family lands, and considerable uptick in applications for Florida Forever. So you would see more orange and yellow on this map when I update it than it is here now. But the main point still stays the same, that 8 million acres of opportunity area is not going to be solved by 2 million acres of these programs. You still have a big opportunity gap where there's work that needs to be done. And some of those areas are not going to be solved by Florida Forever or Rural and Family, because it doesn't look like a Florida Forever or Rural and Family landscape. The corridor was developed through the Florida Ecological Greenways Network model. Tom Hochter at the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning at UF and his team and a technical advisory group created this first Ecological Greenways Network model in the late 90s, and has been updated every few years in order to accommodate the places that we've saved and the places that we've lost, because the map changes over time. So it's not a static corridor, and we have opportunities to preserve some pieces that could lock them in, and we may also cul-de-sac some areas that were once corridor connections, and we lose those connections. But how that map was created was through 26 ecological area data layers. It includes native species habitat, dark sky overlays, important aquifer recharge areas, and those will show you these ecological hubs of really high value that are going to score high on a Florida Forever ARC ranking. And then you look at the hubs that are created from that, and you see that a lot of them aren't connected. So those 7 connectivity layers were used to piece those together to see what are the most viable places where we can preserve and conserve the existing connections. And a lot of those connectivity model acres are heavily impacted. They don't have natural hydrology. They don't have native species. They're not hubs of biodiversity. So they don't attract the Florida Forever and Rural Family Lands dollars. And yet they're critical pieces. So part of our job is to look at this map. And again, I always want to make sure we give a shout out to Larry Harris and Reed Moss and the other folks that really changed the landscape conservation picture and how we look at it, because that mid-80s map effort that Larry and Tom developed for the Florida Reserve Network looks an awful lot like the corridor today. So this isn't something that we've created, but we see wisdom and value in it and work to try to make sure that we can fulfill it. And a lot of it overlaps with the CHNEP boundary. The first 3 layers of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network model make up the corridor, and the Peace River and Mayaca River watersheds are really important connections, not only for panther dispersal, but for water and the health of the aquatic system in Charlotte Harbor. And a lot of the land acquisition that's been done since the act passed has occurred in this boundary as well. So you can see some of those pins. I have a series of images that will just showcase some of the photos that Carlton Ward has taken, which are from these properties. A lot of them are working lands. A lot of them are areas that are still in private ownership but have been conservation needs. Some of them are fee simple acquisitions. That's next slide. Too small for you to read. So Recoosahatchee Ecoscape Florida Forever Project, Henry County. King Family Ranch, DeSoto County. Riles Citrus and Cattle, Charlotte County. Mayaca Ranch Lands, Manatee County. Chaparral Slough, Glades County. Devil's Garden, Hendry County. Horse Creek Ranch, DeSoto and Hardy County. And well, those aerial photos are really good because we such a flat state, we don't really have the benefit of perspectives. And being able to get up in a fire tower or see drone footage is really critical to be able to see how the landscape really is connected. And just driving down the roads and seeing just a few feet in from your right and left windows doesn't do justice to the fragmentation and risk in our vulnerable areas, or to the areas that are wide and robust and a wealth of connectivity as well. So again, the storytelling depends a lot on what vehicles we're using to tell that story, and Carlton's imagery and film is a good way to do that. But also maps and showing trends, the 2070 maps that we continue to use and go back to, that hopefully continue to tell that story, that the trend that we're going at, if we don't plan around the corridor, is a fragmented landscape. We'll still have some really great properties and postage stamps, but that are disconnected and no longer play the role of providing continuity for local extinctions or extirpations, where you have small patch of habitat where the last bear gets hit by a car. The only way you're ever going to see a bear come back to that little patch is if there's a connection that can get that bear there. And I also just want to share too, we use bears and panthers because they're big, charismatic, and can kind of excite the public, but it gets down to the insects and other less charismatic wildlife people don't know about. All of that's a big part of this ecological puzzle and the stories that we try to tell, and getting people to recognize But where those hotspots and those bottlenecks are is important to develop an understanding of urgency. And this is part of that Peace River corridor. And this is Polk County. You can see up at the top, there's Lakeland, Bartow, and there's some gaps that we've identified. And we'll use the term hotspot to talk about areas that have rapid land conversion from a corridor compatible footprint to rooftops or some non-compatible use. And so a hotspot is an area of rapid conversion, and a bottleneck is an area that's less than a mile wide. And it's narrow and vulnerable because of its geometry. And the Lake Wells Ridge over on the right is rapidly changing. A lot of the orange groves are turning into something else, but you look inland as well, and you see some urban growth in some of these communities as well. And along this Peace River, there's some very narrow riparian stretches that don't have protection. So that's on our radar as a hotspot and bottleneck focus for us. We want to make sure that those connections are preserved. And as we're spending dollars, is there an appropriate for forever rural and family lands purchase? If not, how else do we get these pieces connected and protected in perpetuity? This quote is sort of governs a lot of the education, simplifying it down to the reality that remaining connected is important. We have to do that. Another quote I love is a Wendell Berry quote where he adapts the golden rule to conservation and says, "Do unto those downstream as you'd have those upstream do unto you." That's really important when we're talking about water, but it also relates to time. If we think about the flow of time, and we think about expanding our planning horizon to understand that generations from now, some of the choices, decisions that we make and that we agonize over, they're going to look back and say, "Thank you, we're glad you saved that." There'll be other places that they look back and say, "You got it wrong." We'll miss some things we think we got wrong. It's going to happen. So we have to be humble and careful and meticulous and measure and monitor and assess. We can't cut those out of our budgets. We have to make sure that we're tracking in those areas. But we also have to have a long enough planning and monitoring horizon to really capture what some of those pros and cons are. Because if your fiscal horizon is very short, you may make the wrong decision. And I love the fact that Carlton Ward happens to be an 8th generation Floridian. And at the time Carlton Ward's predecessors were first ranching in Florida, that was the same time that Buckingham Smith went down to do a reconnaissance in the Everglades to answer 2 questions. Can we drain the Everglades? And if we can, should we? Buckingham Smith reported back to Congress the following year, 1848, yes, we can, and yes, we should. Saying that this place is worse than worthless. It's beautiful, but it's worse than worthless. That was 1848. 1916, the first piece of conservation property in Florida was purchased. It's within the corridor. That was the Royal Palm State Park. 960 acres of the Everglades. Our attitudes changed. Our understanding of the value changed. It's not only beautiful, but it's important. So the things that we do today is we're piecing together or stitching together this corridor are going to have ramifications long after. So when we look at the value and the perspective of, is it worth it? I think it's important for us to just take that long view. So that's it. I don't know. I have no idea if I have time left for questions, but
Yes.
You do.
I'd love to have.
We have about 10 minutes.
Yeah, if any of you can think of ways that messaging sticky points for you all dealing with budgets or approvals or support from decision makers of the public, those are places where if the corridor foundation ourselves can't help solve some of those obstacles, maybe we can connect with folks who can. So I'd love to hear from you all as well.
Thank you very much. This group has heard they've seen a lot of this type of information about what's happening to the natural parts of Florida, the ecologically connected parts of our state, especially in Southwest Florida. And it's always, encouraging to hear what's possible and what's being done. And it's sobering because we know what's also happening on a daily basis. So thank you very much. Comments from the committee?
comment and a question. One of the things that, talking to folks from our research institute, and I think others deal with when looking for restoration projects, is oftentimes developers are much quicker than we are. And sometimes areas that are identified for development or beginning development have already started before we've been able to comprehend the value of that location. So for the project that just started with CHNP and FWC and BTT and others, looking at stormwater infrastructure for protecting things like smoke and tarpon. So I guess my question is, for you guys in your work, do you have a process? Have you figured out how to identify some of these areas before they're slated for development? I guess we just feel behind, right? And that it's going up on 75 towards Sarasota right now, all those new apartment complexes coming in and housing development that it's not in the public eye. And it's like, well, if we know. So I guess I'm just curious if you guys have found something that works.
I could share a little bit about how we approach sort of that scale question, but I don't know if I'll ever get to a point where I think I'll not feel behind. The state's just growing so fast.
I think that's the curse of this field.
Yeah, and one of the things that there are a number of tools that can help to identify some of the urgency and priority perspectives that are useful to us that we share. And starting off just with the boundary, that 18 million acre boundary, and sharing that as widely as we can. It's downloadable as a shapefile or a KMZ or a KML, and having people just use that, trying to get county planning departments to regularly put that up in front of them whenever they're looking at whether it's a comp plan amendment or zoning changes or approval of individual developments, just to see how it lines up. Is this an area that's a bottleneck, it's narrow? Do we need to, as a result of it being narrow, do we need to pay closer attention? We commissioned a little over a year ago a study from the McKinsey group that took another look at urgency, and out of that study came this horizons 1, 2, and 3. Horizon 1 included the highest priority ecological areas that were slated to be lost potentially by 2030. There are 500,000 acres within the corridor that we expect to be lost by 2030 unless they're conserved. So we look at that and we see the numbers. You can look at that 500,000 acres. Another question is, are those the acres that we're conserving through the land acquisition programs? So we can hit a high number of acres, but if it's not the acres that we need to hit because we're missing the urgent ones, then that's trouble. And the only way that I can think of to play catch up is to empower the local folks as much as possible and share the tools with them. Let them know that there are these urgencies and shoot that information. So many good tools, so many really effective tools are available. They just sit on gathering digital dust in somebody's file and they're not regularly used and incorporated. So one of the things we're trying to do, again, is just share. And our organization has these collaboration teams, sort of multi-sector, multi-organization groups where folks come together to tackle some of these problems. And one of them is the Corridor Compatible Communities Collaboration Team. Debbie, you're on that. And that's trying to look at where, two questions. Where should we and should we not put in a community? Where's the appropriate place to site a community? And then once you've cited a community, are there things you can do that can make that community compatible within the design field? And so we're trying to get as many people involved in that so that the product is usable. And then after that, we'll need to do a lot of work to get it into the hands of the people that actually would be using this with practitioners. That was a long answer for that question.
And so Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast is only one of the land trusts in Florida. The land trusts in Florida do cooperate, collaborate, talk together all the time, share information. We basically cover the state, and we are part of the implementation of this corridor and looking for the federal, state, local funds, helping expand and create new funding programs, the marketing and the communication is so critical to help us at wherever we are, get willing sellers, because we can't do anything. The landowner doesn't want to sell. So it's part of it, having to educate and build the community support and the political support to actually implement this. And so looking at the CHNEP area, not all of it, mostly just the eastern portion is within the Florida Wildlife Corridor, but that, and we talked about this a lot, that does not mean our coastal corridors, our local watersheds aren't critical to making these east-west connections to the north-south. And so it really, I think it's really important that everyone recognize you're part of this, even if your geography may not be 100% included. All of us have to be talking about the importance of all the linkages, or we're going to lose the important things on the coastal area, which is where most of the voters are, where there's a lot of money. And so really all needs to work together.
Great point, Debbie. And that reminds me too, that FEGN model has a priority 4 and priority 5. They're not part of the corridor boundary, but they do show other connections that are important. They're kind of the regional to local branches of the conservation tree in the state. And they'll include a lot of those areas that you're referring to.
It's time for one more.
More of a question and a comment. I appreciate the visuals and the excellent presentation, and I couldn't think of a potentially hazardous situation for wildlife where we have a bottleneck intersecting a roadway. And I was wondering, are you partnering with local governments and entities to promote wildlife passes over these roadways, as I could think of this causing a lot of mortality for wildlife as they cross?
Absolutely. FDOT's District 1 has done a really good job over the past decade of taking a close look at all of their structures, bridges, culverts, box culverts, and seeing what's using them and what's not, looking at the wildlife collision data and identifying where there are mortality hotspots for wildlife, and figuring out places where we may need to put in new crossings and starting to pay more fund and incorporate some of those into designs. There's a lot more we can do, but FDOT District 1's been a leader. District 5 has also been helping, and FSTOT Foundation, William Freund and his group have partnered with FDOT to capture a lot of this footage as well on some of these crossings to help get the public excited and involved. That's very important. And it's also true that there are some places where black bear, as an example, might take a little walkabout, but we know it's a cul-de-sac. It's going to end in a neighborhood. We don't want it to go there. So we also have to start thinking about places where it's an attractive nuisance potentially for wildlife because it's a connection to nowhere. And what kinds of conflicts that might imply, whether it ends at a road or it ends at a neighborhood. So like I said, it is complicated. It's a great question.
Can you leave some cards on the table so that we can follow up with you? I think we probably have a lot of potential collaboration. And thanks, Jennifer, for making sure that Jason was on this.
Thank you.